Hello and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Helen Bennett, LLG's Executive Director of Policy and Governance, and Dennis Hall, LLG Bulletin Editor.
Hi everyone.
Now then, reorganisation is all over the place. It's in the MJ and every other sector publication at the moment, with big questions over potential complex boundary changes. Do take a look at our corporate partner update tab within the resource page of our website for lots of helpful articles on devolution, including recent additions from Bevan Britain. So let's stick with reorganisation. Dennis, what's the latest?
Well, the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government has urged councils that are set to embark on reorganisation to make every effort to work together, to submit a single proposal to the government rather than competing proposals. The call came in a set of statutory invitation letters to council leaders sent on Thursday, the 6th of February, from the Government Minister Jim McMahon. Now, the letters set out Whitehall's expectations for reorganisation, as well as a series of deadlines for regions to comply with. And the Minister said, it is not in Council's taxpayers' interest to devote public funds and valuable time and effort into the development of multiple proposals, which unnecessarily fragment services, compete against one another, require lengthy implementation periods, or which do not sufficiently address local interests and identities. McMahon went on and said that cases where areas cannot jointly develop and submit a joint proposal will not be a barrier to progress, and the government will consider any suitable proposals submitted by the relevant local authorities. On the costs of the programmes, the letter said, considering the efficiencies that are possible through reorganisation, we expect that areas will be able to meet transition costs over time from existing budgets, including from the flexible use of capital receipts that can support authorities in taking forward transformation and invest to save projects. Now, turning to those indebted councils, McMahon's letter said that the default position is that assets and liabilities remain locally managed by councils, but the government do acknowledge that there are exceptional circumstances where there's been a failure linked to capital practices, as they described them. And the letter goes on, where that is the case, proposals should reflect the extent to which the implications of this can be managed locally, including as part of efficiencies possible through reorganisation, and commissioners should be engaged in these discussions.
Well, I know that non-priority regions have been given a deadline of the 21st of March to submit their interim plans ahead of a final deadline of the 28th of November for their full proposals. Those authorities are listed in the item in the bulletin. Now, in regions that have been selected for the priority programme, councils must come together and submit their full proposals by the 26th of September. In the run-up to the September deadline, the government said that councils in the priority scheme should submit an interim plan by the 21st of March and that these areas should conduct mayoral elections for their strategic authority in May 2026. Legislation will be made to postpone the local elections in priority areas from 25 to May 26, the letter added.
Now, the government will also consult across priority areas in February and March on the benefits of devolution. Once again, details of the priority areas are listed in the bulletin item. Surrey, meanwhile, has its own timeline, with requirements that it submits an interim plan by the 21st of March this year and a full proposal as soon as the 9th of May. Finally, in his letter to the Surrey councils, Jim McMahon said, given the urgency of creating sustainable unitary local government for Surrey, I've decided to make legislation to postpone the local elections in that area from May 2025 to May 2026 to provide additional capacity for speeding up reorganisation. Helen.
Yes, well, the chair of the LGA's People and Place Board, Martin Tett, has called for Whitehall and the LGA to offer education and training to those about to go through organisation. And he should know what it's like because 5 years ago he went through unitarisation at Buckinghamshire. Now, in other news, the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act 2024, Commencement Number 3 Regulations 2025 have come into force, causing several provisions within the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act to come into force on the 3rd of March 2025. Now, the sections of relevance are Section 49, that's a change of non-residential limits on right to manage claims. Section 50, cost of right to manage claims. Section 51, compliance with obligations arising under Chapter 1 of Part 2 of the Common and Leasehold Reform Act 2022. Section 52, which are no first instance applications to the High Court in tribunal matters. Section 64, which is restriction on recovery of non-litigation costs, insofar as it inserts 20J of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985 as regards the right to manage. Now, there's probably too many legal details there for the podcast, Dennis.
Well, nonetheless, very necessary, Helen, because the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act will make a number of significant changes to the law in this area. Sections of the Act are coming into force in a staggered way. And it's also the second part of a legislative package to reform English and Welsh property law overall. And it follows on from the Leasehold Reform Ground Rent Act 2022, which put an end to ground rents for most new qualifying long residential leasehold properties in England and Wales.
It's worth just reminding ourselves, Dennis, that the intention of the Act was to make it easier and cheaper for leaseholds to extend their lease or buy their freehold. The significant areas not yet in force, as I understand it, are the increase of the standard lease extension terms to 990 years for both houses and flats, prohibition of the sale of new leasehold houses except in exceptional circumstances, and greater transparency over service charges by requiring standardised billing formats.
And we should probably note here, Helen, that many freeholders and property owners all argue that the Act infringes their property rights. They say that this could lead to significant financial challenges. There are already judicial reviews taking place, claiming that provisions such as the cap on exiting ground rents and the removal of the marriage value calculation actually all breach human rights legislation.
Yep, that's right, Dennis. And the UK government is embroiled in several legal challenges, despite the fact that many provisions of the Act have yet to come into force, or certainly they started them before they did. Multiple parties, including charities and property owners, have launched lawsuits alleging significant financial harm as a result of the proposed changes. And probably one of the most prominent challenges comes from John Lyons charity. It's a children's charity that claims the new legislation will divert significant income away from their operations. According to John Lyons, the exclusion of marriage value from the calculation of enfranchisement under the Act could result in a 1.4 million annual loss for the charity.
Indeed, and that's quite right, Helen. And on the 31st of January, just gone, the Administrative Court granted permission for a group of institutional investor clients of a company called Homeground, along with 5 other freehold claimants, to proceed to a substantive hearing on this.
Well, we'll definitely follow the litigation and report back when we know more. Now, sticking with housing and homes, Dennis, we can expect changes later this year, I understand.
Indeed, we can. A law to force social landlords to investigate and fix hazards within a set timescale will be introduced in phases from October 2025, the government has now announced. The legislation has been named Awaab's Law in honour of Awaab Ishak, a 2-year-old boy who died in December 2020 from a respiratory condition caused by prolonged exposure to mould in his social home. The government said social landlords will have to investigate and fix dangerous damp and mould within a set amount of time, as well as repair all emergency hazards within 24 hours. Landlords who fail to comply face being taken to court, with social tenants able to use the full powers of the law to hold them to account, the ministry said. And the ministry also said Awaab's Law would be introduced through a phased approach to ensure that it applied as effectively as possible. And it added, this means that the protections that it provides to damp and mould will be introduced quickly, which would not have been possible if the government applied the law to a wider group of hazards from the outset. And this will also allow the government to test and learn so that the reforms benefit social landlords and secure the lasting legacy that Awaab Ishak's family have fought so hard for.
That's right, and I understand, excuse me, the phases are as follows. From October 2025, social landlords will have to address damp and mould hazards that present a significant risk of harm to tenants, and this will be according to fixed timescales. Also, from October this year, social landlords will also have to address all emergency repairs, including for damp and mould or other hazards, as soon as possible and within no longer than 24 hours. Incidentally, I know there's several local authorities that are using mould indicators, alarms, little devices in homes that can report back where levels get above a certain point, which I think is quite useful. In 2026, requirements will expand to apply to a wider range of hazards. These include excess cold and excess heat, falls, structural collapse, fire, electrical and explosions, and hygiene hazards. And then in 2027, the requirements of Awaab's law will expand to the remaining range of hazards, so quite a legacy.
Indeed it is, and the Ministry said the government will introduce powers through the Renters' Rights Bill to extend Awaab's law to the private rented sector, and will hold a consultation on how this will apply in a way that works for the sector and is fair and proportionate for both tenants and landlords. The government will also consult on a new decent home standard and minimum energy efficiency standards to ensure that all tenants' homes are made safe, warm and free from disrepair. And there are also plans as well to legislate to require social landlords to carry out electrical safety checks at least every 5 years, as well as undertake mandatory appliance inspections on all electrical appliances that are provided by the landlord. Helen.
Well, let's now move on to the work of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, who've published a blog entitled Peer Pressure, Work of the House of Lords Appointments Commission. Now, the Independent House of Lords Appointments Commission was first established in May 2000, and it was meant to be an interim measure, but 25 years later, the committee state that its role and remit remain part of the wider discussion on Lords reform taking place as the Hereditary Peers Bill passes through Parliament.
And here's a little bit of history for you, Helen. The House of Lords Appointment Committee did not originate actually from a recommendation from the Committee on Standards in Public Life. In actual fact, it was established by the Blair government as a new body to take on the role of appointing crossbench peers, previously carried out by Downing Street. It was then given the additional role, previously done by the Political Honours Scrutiny Committee in the Cabinet Office, of vetting political nominees to the House.
I love a bit of history, Dennis. Now, the Commission runs an open, merit-based process for the appointment of non-party political peers, and it looks for people with experience and expertise to bring to the process of scrutinising legislation in the House. I understand over 5,500 people have applied, and there have been a total of 76 peers appointed in this way in the last 25 years. And of these, only 2 non-party political peers are appointed each year. Now, while the number and timing of these appointments remain a matter for the Prime Minister, the choice of whom to recommend is made by the Commission alone.
Well, yes, that's right, Helen. And the second role that the Commission plays is in vetting individuals who are nominated by the political parties. Unlike non-party political appointments, it is not asked to assess the suitability or merit of those being put forward, but to carry out a range of checks with regulators, government departments and agencies. They make an overall assessment of whether the nominee meets its published criteria.
And that criteria, Dennis, is that, quote, an individual should be in good standing in the community in general and with the public regulatory authorities in particular, and that the past conduct of the nominee would not reasonably be regarded as bringing the House of Lords into disrepute. Now, the Commission's advice is given in confidence, with the final decision left to the Prime Minister, and only once was its advice not accepted, and that was in the year, actually it was in the year 2000 when it was established, and the Chair wrote to Parliament who was then able to put this information into the public domain to ensure transparency and accountability. Arguably, I would submit that perhaps this should happen on each occasion, but maybe that's a push too far. The House of Lords Appointment Commission has also mooted taking responsibility for party nominations, which the chair supports, but is not a view necessarily shared with others. So the House of Lords Hereditary Peers Bill is currently working its way through Parliament and is at the committee stage in the House of Lords. Dennis.
Well, Helen, in my next item, I want to talk about Generation Z and the legal sector. Helen, I know what you're wondering, and yes, I do know what Generation Z is. It's those people born between 1997 and 2012, as I understand it. And there's been a new and interesting report published, and it's entitled, "Is the Law Still an Attractive Career for Generation Z?" And did you know that by 2030, Generation Z will account for more than 30% of the working population? Hence, the International Bar Association has commissioned this report, which covers 28 jurisdictions, including England and Wales, to look at the question of whether this generation was losing interest in legal careers. It found no sign that it was, but it does shed some light on what expectations and characteristics this part of the sector currently possess. So, law firms and legal departments need to start adapting to the concerns and motivations of Generation Z as they begin to enter the workplace. Employers wanting their pick of the best lawyers will need to be conscious of the concerns and motivations of this generational cohort.
Well, it's an interesting report, and it explained that Gen Z will not be bullied or tolerate harassment to the same degree as previous generations. They want apparently interesting and challenging work, but not at the expense of the rest of their lives. And here's another point from the report. Although they may come into the workforce better qualified on paper than their predecessors, they will all have missed out on important formative social interactions because of COVID-19 and the toxic effects of social media, which is known to reduce attention spans, according to the report. And the report goes on, they may well need more support, especially in the early years of their careers, to find their way effectively into a world of work. The legal sector will quickly need to get better at supervision and mentoring, and that will indeed be a challenge in remote working environments.
Helen, thanks for the correction, by the way. I did say Generation Z, but I think it is Gen Z, isn't it? So I'll continue as you started. So the report described Gen Z as a generation of contradictions, craving both security and independence. They want the freedom to be creative, but with the safety net of mentoring and support from employers. The financial side of a job was, of course, important to Gen Z, but they did not want to earn more money for its own sake. Rather, they said they want to ensure that their salaries are sufficient to support the lifestyles that they aspire to. And this meant that interest in high-paying entry-level jobs will not necessarily translate into long-term careers with the same employer, the report went on. And Gen Z is interested in creativity, flexibility, and variety. Legal sector employers are likely to need to start thinking about how to manage a less stable workforce. Legal employers that want to stand out to Gen Z will identify and articulate their social values, the report said. So here's the question. Are local government legal managers ready to change to meet the new challenges associated with employing Gen Z? Helen.
Well, that's very interesting, Dennis. And I think it is generation Z. You could say
Yes.
I think Gen Z is a bit more modern, is it? It's probably what Gen Z would say.
I think you are on point, and it does sound more trendy, and I am keen to be trendy.
Well, it's interesting, Dennis, and especially so because stereotypically Generation X, and I think Generation X refers, as one myself do refer to themselves as Generation X, is a completely different kettle of fish. And I think that our values and expectations were completely different going into the workforce. And of course, it's important to recognise those differences because Generation X are taking up the majority of senior leadership roles within local government due to our ageing workforce, and therefore it's a matter that really needs to be considered seriously. And I suspect the answer is in finding a balance through communication and adaptability, but we'll see. It's interesting. Now, finally from me, taken from the LGA Bulletin, Councillor Bev Craig, she's the Vice Chair of the LGA and lead member for education, has given evidence to the Bill Committee on the Children's Welfare and Schools Bill, in which she discussed the LGA's support for the bill, but raised concerns around, as ever, resourcing and funding, but also a focus on the children who are not on the school's register. Now, whilst the LGA acknowledges that most parents provide an excellent education at home, Councillor Craig emphasised the importance of local authority oversight to ensure all children are safe and receiving a suitable education, especially in light of recent cases where the system has failed to protect vulnerable children, and we'll all be aware of those because they've been prolific in the news. So the bill includes measures to improve safeguarding and welfare of children, regulate care workers and support children in care or children leaving care. And it also proposes new restrictions on homeschooling, requires state-funded academies to follow the national curriculum, and mandates qualified teacher status for all teachers by 2026. That's next year, in fact. It's quite a short time frame. Now, the press coverage has tended to centre so far on the response by academies to what some claim are limiting academy freedoms in their ability to tailor education to student needs. There was also some concern voiced over the rejection of an amendment that would have allowed parents to view all classroom materials on the basis that this lack of transparency, some argued, could prevent parents from fully understanding what their children are being taught.
And conversely, Helen, provisions to support children in care or leaving care have been well received, including defining kinship carers in the law and requiring local authorities to offer group decision-making meetings before taking a child into care. And the bill also proposes regulations for care workers and establishments. And it also includes breakfast club provision, which we know is essential to learning. According to research by Kellogg's, 2.4 children in every classroom in England and Wales will arrive at school hungry at least once a week.
Well, it's scandalous when you think about it. Now, the Children's Charity Coalition have stated that the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill marks a pivotal moment for child protection and safeguarding. They go on to say that it is the first major piece of legislation in over a decade with a clear focus on improving safety and care for children and families. It is encouraging, they say, that we are now on the cusp of having a strengthened foundation to take forward. The bill, incidentally, is currently at the report stage in the House of Commons. And on that note, that's it for another edition of the podcast. You can read more on these items and many more discussed today by going to bulletin number 6, available on the LLG website now. So it's goodbye from me.
And from me too. Bye now.